That's good. All right, we might make a start. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this session of the festival. My name is Jeff Sparrow. I'll be your chair for this morning's proceedings. For your entertainment and edification, today we'll be discussing the topic sex and the soft right. What do moderate conservatives and libertarians have to say when it comes to matters of sex, family and equality? The way we'll be running things is we'll be discussing on stage for about 45 minutes or so, and then there'll be a chance for you to ask questions through the special electronic system that they have here. That will all be explained in due course. Now's probably a good time to remind you, if you have a mobile phone, perhaps put it onto silent mode so as to not interrupt people next to you. While you do that, I'll acknowledge and pay respect to the Tasmanian Aboriginal community as the traditional custodians of the land, and acknowledge their elders, past, present, and emerging. All right, without further ado, let's get underway. I'll introduce our two panellists to you on my left. Dana Fleischman is an evolutionary psychologist at the University of Portsmouth. Next to her is Claire Lehmann, who's an Australian writer and the founder and editor of Quillette magazine. Please make them both welcome. All right, we're talking about how moderate conservatives and libertarians respond to questions of sex, family, and related issues. So I thought I might begin with somebody, a figure who is perhaps relevant to many moderate conservatives and also some libertarians at least. Margaret Thatcher famously called the family the building block of society. Is that something with which the two of you agree? Why don't we start with you, Claire? What does the family mean to you? Is it indeed a building block?
Yeah, I would agree with that. Is this working?
I cannot hear you.
I would agree with that. However, the nuclear family is a somewhat new construct, but family in terms of biological parents looking after their own children and having tight units of people who look after each other and care for each other, that is absolutely foundational to any society that's going to work. You can't just have children being looked after by people who are not related to them, like on a mass scale. So I definitely think there's truth in that statement.
Can I just check, is that sound okay?
Okay.
While someone fixes that, maybe I'll turn to Dana. What about you? What do you make of this concept of the family as the building block? I mean, and in particular, what political and social function should we accord to the family? I mean, the key thing about Thatcherism, it seems to me, is while Thatcherism made the family more relevant to most people in that there were less social security supports and the family had to take up the slack, at the same time it also put the family under a lot of pressure. So should society be buttressing the family?
Yeah, I have actually quite mixed views about this. So on the one hand, I do think that people take better care of their parents and their children and their grandparents than unrelated strangers do. So it actually does make sense for society to say the family is very important and to actually uphold the family. But I also don't necessarily think that families always do the best job of raising children necessarily. So I think that children are, to a great extent, the product of their genetics. There's a lot of good evidence that it just doesn't matter that much. As long as the environment is good enough, children turn out fairly similarly. Mother's love and father's love is obviously wonderful in the context, but there's not really good evidence that it makes a huge amount of difference. And I'm a big fan of a book by B.F. Skinner from the 60s called Walden 2, in which everything is centralized and everybody's actually raised in a way that has scientifically been found to be the best way to potentially raise children. And while each of those children is not going to have people who are as invested in them, given that parents are actually very sensitive to their children's manipulation, I actually think it might be better if everybody was raised in the way that was scientifically considered the best possible way in order to actualize people's potential. So on the one hand, I do think that families are the most effective way to get everybody taken care of. I do think that there are possibly better ways to do it that are less natural that we just don't know about yet.
Because that's quite a different perspective to, say, someone like Corey Bernardi, who you might not be familiar with, but it's a conservative Australian politician who says we should defend traditional families and traditional family values that's a different perspective to the one you're putting forward.
Yeah,
Is
it's a
it
very
not?
different perspective. So I think the tradition has its place, and I think the traditions are often very important. There's this concept which is called Chesterton's fence, and the idea is that if you went and you bought a piece of farmland and there was a fence in the middle of it, you might not see actually what the fence was for, but you wouldn't necessarily want to tear it down because it might have some important use that you don't know about, right? And if we were actually to dismantle traditions and family, for example, we might lose things that we hold dear. We actually might not know would be knock-on effects of actually not supporting the family as much as we should. So I do see why many people are very supportive of the family in that they like society the way it is, and they know that the family is as they have been, or they like traditional values. They know that the family has been the building block of those values. I'm just not sure if things can be done better. I actually have no attachment specifically to family or tradition in this context.
As the moderate conservative on this panel, Claire, what would be your take on that? I mean, for Bernardi, I would imagine that the traditional family is the mum and the dad and the 2.5 children, and he would argue that this particular unit should be rewarded and buttressed by society, and people like, I would suspect many of us here who don't live in that sort of arrangement should not receive the same societal support. Would you agree with that?
I don't know if I'd go that far, but I certainly agree with what Diana said about not destroying institutions that we don't fully understand. So there's an effect that some evolutionary psychologists have found called the Cinderella effect, which is that children who grow up in households where there are adults that are unrelated to them suffer more abuse and neglect than if they grow up in households with two biological parents. So my orientation is towards protecting the most vulnerable people, and that is children, particularly younger children, and having adults around children who are related to those children is generally the safest option that we know of. And I mean, I certainly think society can do a much better job in supporting young families, helping parents, because it's a tremendously difficult job, and we can have more social services to support parents. And I understand social conservatives' points of view that family breakdown is a bad idea, because as soon as children are neglected and abused, then there are all of these knock-on effects, and then it becomes a cycle and so on and so forth. I wouldn't go as far as Bernardi in stigmatising people who have alternative family arrangements, however.
Yes, because Dana, I'm not massively familiar with your work, but some of the stuff that I've seen is you arguing in favour of polygamy, for instance. I'm not making a terrible mistake here.
Who, me?
Yeah. I suddenly had a terrible thought that I've Googled the wrong person. But that would be clearly something that would fall in the spectrum of the kind of non-traditional family values that someone like Corey Bernardi would see as something to be stamped out.
So I have talked a lot about polyamory. Polygyny is actually totally cool with me too. Actually, that is the most traditional form of the family. Is actually more than one wife and a husband. That is the biblical traditional marriage, and I think that there actually might be some benefits to it. Certainly, if there were more helpers at the nest.
So you're saying it is traditional family
If I could have a wife, I would. I mean, a wife and a husband, and then I could do whatever I liked, and then they could take care of the kids. That would be amazing. Because women are actually very unlikely to abuse children. It's actually usually unrelated males that abuse young children. But yes, that is a non-traditional family. I can see very much why governments and politicians would say that these traditional families, what they're basically doing is all the jobs that the government doesn't want to do more effectively than the government can do them, which is taking care of and bringing up family, which is taking care of the elderly. They're doing these jobs much better than any third party or government institution could do. And by romanticizing and sprinkling magic on it, you're basically also helping people feel like that's more important. So I could definitely see why people could do that. I think that it might be the best solution that we have right now. Certainly, I mean, I don't have children, but I have looked after my elderly grandparents, and I definitely have seen the huge difference in how well family look after elderly people compared to unrelated people. And actually, I think elderly people have even less voice in terms of talking about abuse or maltreatment that they might be experiencing. So I agree very much with Claire that if you're thinking about taking care of the most vulnerable people, that traditional institutions are the most effective at taking care of those people.
Okay, well, let's talk about one of the social functions that the family performs, which is social reproduction, particularly domestic labour. I think the most recent statistics on that suggest that in Australia, and I don't know what it's like in the United States, I suspect the figure's perhaps similar, but in Australia, the average woman does 7 hours more domestic labour than the average man in the course of a week. How would you respond to a statistic like that? I mean, if either of you were in a relationship with a man, would you expect the housework to be done equally? Because this seems to me that unequal distribution of housework, for instance, is a traditional family value in the way that someone like Bernardi would define it. The woman looks after the family.
Yeah, I think the division of labour inside the house is definitely a source of major sexual conflict between men and women and couples, and each couple has to negotiate it differently according to how much time they want to invest in their own careers and so on. I think one option is, so men in general are on average do less and care less about the state of the house, and it can be a source of real frustration and anxiety for women. And one way I've thought about it is, rather than beating men over the head with a stick, there are two options. There is have a messier house or get to a point where you can afford help. But I admit that both of those options might reinforce gender inequality, but I honestly, it is a major source of conflict, and I don't know that many ways around it.
I mean, because with respect, I'm not sure that seems a very viable solution for most people. I mean, you can say they should get to a point where they can afford help, but most people are not going to be able to do that.
Yeah, well, I think we have to be honest and point out that the 9 to 5 work structure, where you go to work from 9 to 5 for 5 days a week, that career track was built upon the assumption that you had a wife at home doing the chores at home. And now that women and men are doing the 9 to 5, 5 day a week, fulfilling that timeline, who's going to do the rest of the work? And the additional work, whether it's raising children or doing the housework or both, is a full-time job. So we're in a situation where families and couples have all of this work that has to be done in addition to their full-time jobs. And I think as a society, we haven't confronted this issue honestly or grappled with it. And I think one way of dealing with it is to get rid of the 9 to 5, 5 days a week work structure and have everyone working a flexible timetable that suits their own lifestyle.
What about you, Dana? I mean, that's 7 hours a week. That's essentially one extra working day.
Yeah.
How do we respond to this?
So I agree a lot with what Claire is saying, is that there should be more flexible work schedules, but also the person that cares more does more. And I don't think that there's any kind of social inequality being imposed on men and women. Men on average are less disgust sensitive than women. Women on average are more disgust sensitive. They care more about cleanliness. If I told you that men spend 4 hours more a month detailing their cars than women, you wouldn't say that was an example of gender inequality. You'd say that was an example of men caring more, doing more. And I do think that women could do a lot less and actually have things be satisfactory. When I read this piece a while ago about the kind of emotional labor of domestic labor, and a woman talking about how little her husband did around the house, she was talking about how one of her children only likes smooth peanut butter and the only one only likes crunchy, and she has to be in charge of who does that. I just think it might actually be better for the husband to be in charge and say, you both eat the same peanut butter, I don't care, right? So I don't understand why this has become such a kind of fundamental issue. There was a big study in the United States done of very highly quantitatively gifted men and women, people who had made near perfect score on the quantitative part of the SAT, and they followed them for several years, and they asked men and women, at your ideal job, would you work 40 hours a week or more? right? And these people are people who are very gifted and talented in these kind of cognitive domains, and they could get, you know, very high-paying jobs. And 8% of women on average said that they would work 40 hours a week or more, and 40% of men said on average they would work 40 hours a week or more. So it seems that women actually have a preference to be at the home and to be doing these kinds of domestic labors. And when you give women more options, they tend to choose those things. So I don't know exactly where that comes from. You could say it comes from biology, you can say it comes from society, but I'm not going to rail against choices that women are often making themselves.
So you're a successful woman with a career that's taking you all around the world. Are you saying that then you'd be happy if you're in a relationship and the man said, I'm going to do 7 hours or less housework a week than you, and that's just because of my preferences? Because to me,
if I have a preference for a much cleaner house than the man that I'm with does, then we would end up coming up with some kind of negotiation about that, right? About how much work he should do and how much work that I should do. But there are obviously domains in which I don't care at all what happens, and he does care what happens very much. And, you know, I could list off, obviously they're idiosyncratic to my particular relationship, in which he does more because he cares more, actually, about what happens. And if women want men who are going to do an equal amount of housework, then I agree with Claire, you shouldn't beat them over the head with a stick, as fun as that might be. I think that instead you have to come up with these kind of negotiations, and domestic labor is actually, you're saying that most people can't afford it. I think that it's actually fairly inexpensive. But the other thing I was going to say is that this nuclear family, this idea that people should be living individually in nuclear families in households, 2 parents, 2 children, I also think that that's something that could be done away with, where you could have instead multi-family homes, and then you could have economies of scale. You could have one person doing all of the cooking and cleaning for 3 or 4 different families, rather than one person in each home, which actually I think multiplies that. But I mean,
that is in fact a traditional social solution.
That is the, yeah, and I don't necessarily agree with that. The last thing I'll say is that actually this 7 hours of cooking and cleaning, or whatever it is, domestic labor that women are doing, is often a standard that women hold each other to, that actually it's a matriarchy that upholds that. So if a woman goes to another woman's house and it's a mess, she gossips to her friends that this woman is not a good mother, that, you know, there was ketchup on the baby's face or whatever. It's actually not men who gossip about women not keeping a good home or cooking and cleaning. It's women that do that.
Mother-in-laws.
And mother-in-laws.
We have already touched on this issue, but I may as well pursue it a little bit because it seems to be central to this topic. I mean, one of the key elements of traditional values is to do with the maintenance of sexuality within the home and the committed relationship. And this is an area where values have changed quite starkly. In Australia, for instance, in the early 1970s, premarital sex was thought to be moral by only 29% of the population, whereas the most recent figure I could find, which is from 2012, put that figure at 58%, which, to be honest, surprised me a little bit. I would have thought it would have been higher than that. But this is a fairly major social shift over a short period of time in which people have shifted away from the notion that sexuality is something that should simply be within a committed relationship, primarily for procreation. Do we think this is a good social development, or do we think it's a bad social development, or do we have some different position? Why don't you start, Claire?
I think it's definitely a good social development. I mean, I would lean towards being a libertarian social liberal on matters of sexuality. I can understand why in the past people were much more cautious about sex because contraception was much less reliable, and for women who lived in prior generations, having unprotected sex with a man was a high-risk endeavour. If you ended up pregnant and you weren't looked after well, I mean, very bad things could happen to you. So I understand why society has been very restricted and cautious around sex. But now that we have contraception and technologies which mitigate the downsides of having unprotected sex, I think it's absolutely a great thing that we can express ourselves in a sexual manner without the costs associated.
Yeah. I'm a utilitarian. I think sex is fun and good, and most people enjoy it. And if people are having more sex, I think that's on average better than people having less sex. So I have a very straightforward view on this. But I also do think that what people have been saying, in the United States, there's this incredibly offensive analogy that people make where they talk about if you're a woman and you're a piece of tape, you get less sticky every time you're stuck to something else, which is basically saying that the more sexual partners you have, the less capacity for attachment that you have. And you see this in like non-human animals, like for example in voles. In voles, the first time that they have sex with each other, they become monogamously paired up. Doesn't matter if they have anything common. I mean, they're all voles, right? And so
what's a vole?
A vole is a small rodent. And there's two different species. There's one that's quite promiscuous and there's one that's totally monogamous. And they've actually done these experiments where you can inject their brains and make them either monogamous or promiscuous, which is our future.
And what was the end of this? What's the point of this experiment?
The point of this experiment was actually looking at the neurobiology of love and attachment. So they were interested in that because obviously individuals differ in the extent to which they are comfortable or capable of being monogamous and how many sexual partners they would actually like to have. But in terms of this idea about premarital sex, another thing that was very important was that people would get together and they would form a unit and they would grow together. So I definitely think that when I was 17 or 18 and I was having my first romantic relationships, I became attached to those people I was with disproportionate to how much I had in common with them.
Yes.
Right? I was in love with people that I had really nothing in common with and that I wouldn't even go on a second date with currently, right? Whereas at that time I was very, very sticky, as you would say in the kind of Catholic Christian Pentecostal sense. I was very sticky, and I think that was probably my prime in terms of finding somebody that I could be with forever, right? But now I'm actually much more focused on finding somebody that I'm compatible with on a variety of different characteristics, and I actually am more capable of finding somebody like that. But I can see why traditional people say it's important not to have a premarital sex because of the possibility of pregnancy, but also because I do think, and this is quite a controversial kind of statement, that people are more able to attach in their first sexual relationship or their first couple of sexual relationships than they are later. I'm actually really happy that I've actually taken off those kind of biological shackles because now I can find somebody that I am more compatible with overall, and I don't just fall in love with anybody that I happen to get naked with.
Yeah, because I don't want to harp on the question of the family. We'll move on from this after this, but it does seem to me that there is a tension between the positions that you've put forward about sexuality and this notion of the family as being central in some social sort of sense, because surely the statistic that correlates with the rise of approval for extramarital sex is the breakdown of the long-term relationship, that was centred on marriage. Is there not a tension between, say, that Margaret Thatcher position that having this nuclear family that's going to perform these social services for you is crucial to society, and also the notion that that we can have sex with whoever we want? Certainly that's what a previous generation of conservatives would have made that argument.
There's a lot of really families that hold together very well when people are actually not sexually monogamous to one another. There's obviously a lot of companionate relationships, and there's obviously many people who are running a household, looking after each other, and in previous generations it was fairly acceptable for a man to go not socially acceptable like you would tell everybody, but obviously men saw prostitutes and had mistresses, and it actually had often very little effect. In France, you see a kind of norm where the idea is that, if your husband or wife starts to become less attached to you, they seem like they're not paying as much attention to you when you're talking, etc., and then you think that they might be having an affair, you just kind of let it pass. You let a few months go where you're a bit alienated from each other, and then you expect that they will come back around. And so I don't necessarily think that there's a huge tension between these two things. I think that we should be a little bit more enlightened about how occasionally very strict monogamy doesn't work. There's a sex columnist in the United States called Dan Savage, and he says that if you are in a monogamous marriage and you only have sex with somebody else 3 or 4 times in 40 years, then you actually were pretty good at monogamy. Whereas most people, more traditional people, would say that any sex outside of the main pair bond is a total failure. So I actually think that the idea that sex outside of the main pair bond represents a total failure is something that is breaking down the family more than the sex itself.
Yes, I mean, do you want to weigh in this? I mean, I suppose I'm playing devil's advocate here because I don't really care. But as I say, for a traditional conservative, this is this is the key argument against promiscuity, that it breaks down the nuclear family and that has terrible
Yeah.
social effects.
I think on a personal level, I would tend to agree with Diana, but I know that social conservatives, or people who are more socially conservative, would see the commitment that is entered into in a marriage and the vows that people take provide an absolute of commitment that is quite healthy for a society, making promises that are kept and making long-term commitments that bind people and force people to take sacrifices for others have benefits. And I think the social conservative point of view is that doing away with the absolute ethic of commitment is potentially has costs that we don't fully appreciate.
Okay, let's move on to sex itself. Most people, I think, on the progressive side of politics would come down to on a position of consent where they say as long as both parties or all of the parties involved consent, there is really what they do sexually is nobody else's business. Now, this is an argument that would have been unthinkable in mainstream society 30 or 40 years ago, would have been extreme kind of libertarian position. What do you guys make of that? Is there a specific sexual ethics? Are there some sex acts that are objectively wrong? Or is it simply down to if everyone's into it, it's all fine?
I think this might be a different answer to that question, but I think we overemphasize consent a little bit. Not that consent isn't important, but just because someone consents to have sex doesn't mean all of their needs are looked after. And I think we minimise the intensity and the relationship that is involved when sex happens when we just reduce it to consent. I think it's much larger. I think having sex with a person is much larger than simply a matter of a simple transaction of saying yes or no.
I'm not quite sure I understand the point.
Well, I think so.
Is it like an argument for marriage or something? Or?
No. I think we underestimate how much people emotionally invest in relationships that are sexually active, and just reducing matters of sex to consent is reductionist. There is a lot more going on with people's interior lives, particularly for women. And I think the conversations that we have around sex, where it's only focused on consent, are simplistic and don't capture the full complexity of what happens to people when they enter into sexual relationships.
So would you say, sorry, I'm just trying to tease out the point you're making. Are you saying that there might be a particular form of sexual activity where the woman has consented to it, but the act is still wrong? Is that?
It's not that the act is wrong. So if you're thinking of younger women who potentially haven't got a lot of sexual experience and they're seeing a guy for the first time and they consent to sex, and it all goes well and it's done and dusted, but perhaps the guy is not interested in pursuing a relationship with that girl afterwards, that can be very hurtful and damaging to that young woman. However, we don't discuss that aspect of sexuality very much in our society. We just talk about consent, and if all that happened was the sexual act was consensual, we think of it as okay. But perhaps we should talk more about the sexual conflict between men and women, how men pursue short-term mating strategies more often than women do, and women have long-term mating strategies more frequently than men do. And perhaps we should just be a little bit more open and honest about the potential costs that some young women may incur if they engage in casual sex. That's
Maybe your take on that?
So one of the main areas that I've been doing research on for many years is disgust, and how disgust actually tends to drive our moral emotions. There's this analogy that people make, which is called the elephant and the rider, and your emotions are the elephant and you're the rider. And often you go along for the ride where the elephant takes you, and then you rationalize what happens afterwards. So people are often disgusted at sexual acts or at any variety of different kinds of things, and then they moralize that disgust.
Yes.
Right? So they first feel disgust, and then they moralize it. And people do experience sexual disgust to all kinds of different contexts. And it's true that in the domain of sex, it's actually very important to make certain kinds of decisions. From an evolutionary perspective, it was important that if you had sex, that you had sex that was adaptive in some way, whether for affiliation or for reproduction, right? And so people tend to moralize sex because it is so highly charged in terms of what kinds of maladaptive effects could happen. Let's say people who are having sex who are related, people of the same sex having sex, and also the degree of infectious disease that could happen when people are having sex. So people tend to moralize sex much more than it should be objectively moralized because it's tinged with these very important adaptively relevant kinds of aspects. Whereas I think that now sex is mostly, sexually transmitted diseases. It's actually amazing to me how much people think that they are very common. Sexually transmitted diseases are much less common than people think. People are much more careful than they objectively need to be when it comes to sex. And I talk about this with my students. I teach psychology of human sexuality. Take, for example, something like food. So I think that sex is like, right now, people are engaging in all kinds of sex acts. There's a lot of creative exploration of this domain of pleasure because the risks and costs have been reduced. And I think that's a great thing because I think pleasure is good, right? Whereas if you think about somebody who says that they're quote unquote like a foodie, right? Somebody who eats all kinds of different things, who eats foie gras, who eats ortolan, which are these like little birds, who eats all kinds of different animal products, regardless of the kinds of suffering the animal might have experienced. That is not necessarily as moralized. I think that somebody who sits down to have a plate of eggs and bacon is probably doing something worse in terms of suffering than somebody who fists a willing participant, right? But if I was to ask you which one of those you think is morally wrong, is something that you see people doing all day, every day in shops is going to seem more normal and thus less morally repugnant than something that you see people, or you don't see people do, but you might see people do behind closed doors. And so I do think that it's very interesting how much sex is moralized. And one thing I like to say is like humans are gonna human. It's very difficult to actually leverage out these different intuitions with rationality. But I do think it's important for people to be skeptical of their emotions. And as somebody who works on disgust, I think it's especially important to be skeptical of our disgust sensitivity. And conservatives, on average, tend to be more disgust sensitive than liberals. And that's, I think, some of the way that their positions come into it.
Okay, I feel particularly dense this morning, so maybe I can try to tease that out. So
Sure.
your argument about disgust is that our gut reactions of disgust shouldn't be a basis for our sexual morality. So a previous generation might have been disgusted at the idea of polyamory.
Yeah,
and you would say
and
that
people
that's...
are still disgusted by it. Yeah, people are disgusted by gay sex. I mean, it's very cute. My mother told me this directly. She said, I used to find it really disgusting to see two men kiss. And my mother was always pro gay marriage. And she said she actually tried very hard to think happy thoughts, think about kittens and rainbows when she was watching two men kiss, so that she could get a disgust reaction out of her because she didn't want to feel that reaction. But there's a whole lot of things that people are disgusted by that I think are very good, for human flourishing. I think, for example, that it would be great if people could sell their organs, but people are very disgusted by that. There are places in the world like Japan where you can't even donate your organs. And I think all of that stuff is actually really a disgust-based reaction, not a rational reaction about how many people could be helped.
Maybe that's how we could pay for our household cleaners.
That's, by selling our kidneys. I would absolutely sell a kidney to have somebody do 7 hours worth of housework a week every week.
Just on this disgust reaction, though, does that mean that your position would be that there are no sexual acts, so long as consent is pertaining, there are no sexual acts that are innately wrong?
Innately wrong.
So, for instance, I don't know, we can think of bestiality, or we can think of necrophilia, or there's all sorts of things that a lot of people would think that is just a taboo I wouldn't cross.
Yeah.
Is your position that if everyone's consenting, it's all good? Because there are people who make that argument.
Well, obviously there are contexts in which people cannot consent. I do think it's I had this friend who had an OkCupid profile, and she talked about being vegetarian. Somebody saying, I'm not vegetarian, but I'd like to date you. And she said, do you think that bestiality is okay? And they would say, no, of course not. And as Dan Savage says on his podcast, if I was a lamb, I'd rather be screwed than stewed, right? But people on average think it's okay to eat meat, but they don't think it's okay to fuck a sheep, for example. Even though I think the sheep if the sheep could talk, would have a certain preference in this regard. And so I don't think that a sheep can consent, but I also don't think it can consent to being eaten, and people have no problem with that context. So in short answer, yes, if there are consenting parties, I do think that consent is an onerous concept, as Claire was talking about a moment ago. You can do harm to somebody, you can behave like in an immoral way, even in a totally consenting kind of context. I think part of that is because people have really underestimated how much people are really trying to get their foot in the door for a committed relationship when they are having casual sex. People aren't just having sex all the time, casually because it's fun. Oftentimes it's because they really want to become closer to that person, and then they get rebuffed. But yes, short answer, go for it.
Okay, this might be a good point on which to come back to you, Claire, and the point you were making before about how even when consent is obtained, there can still be harmful consequences. Is that an argument for the idea that's floating around in some feminist circles about we need a different notion of consent? We need to move to an idea of enthusiastic consent, that it's not simply a question of, is that?
I think even that is too simplistic. I think we used to have words in prior years for male behaviour that was not particularly considerate of women. So caddish behaviour, players. But we used to have words to describe men who were exploitative but not necessarily coercive. And I think that with this laser-like focus that we have on sexual coercion, which is not necessarily a bad thing, we're potentially overlooking exploitation that happens of women. And I think we need to, even though it is moralistic to judge men's behaviour that is not considerate of women, I think we need to potentially bring that back and have more of a vocabulary for men who aren't sexually assaulting women, but just aren't treating them with the care and consideration that is perhaps warranted.
I think perhaps I agree with you on that, but I'm still not totally sure. It seems to be almost like an old-fashioned radical feminist position. Like it's very close to someone like Andrea Dworkin. Could you maybe spell out like what, say, social policy would flow from this idea, or how this idea would sort of manifest itself in practice to maybe help explain it?
I don't think any social policy flows from it. I think it's just the way we discuss sexuality and relations between the genders. And where I would depart from second wave feminists like Dworkin is that I think men and women have evolved different sexual strategies, and I don't think it's a product of society. So Dworkin would have argued that women are an oppressed class and men are the oppressors, and the sexual conflict arises from the way society is structured. Whereas I would argue that it comes from our biology, so that's the main difference. But there would be some points of agreement in terms of, I do think that some men, not all men, are exploitative, and they should be shamed to some degree by the rest of us.
Okay. Well, that maybe follows on to the next area that I wanted to open up, which is to do with sexual violence, which is obviously a very hotly debated topic. The most recent stats that I saw was in Australia, 1 woman a week is being murdered by a current or former partner. 1 in 3 Australian women have experienced physical violence since the age of 15. Now, these are shocking statistics. How do we explain this, and what should we be doing about it?
Okay, so I think intimate partner violence and very serious domestic violence where people end up being killed, women in particular, are somewhat different categories of crime. I think you'll find if you look at the statistics on crime that a small minority of repeat offenders do the most harm in society. And so there is likely a very small percentage of men who are beyond rehabilitation and who terrorise their romantic partners in whatever relationship they get into. And I think we need to... One way of dealing with this is potentially coming to grips with the fact that some people cannot be rehabilitated and perhaps prison sentences need to be harsher and longer. But I think it's a mistake to generalise out from this very small percentage of recidivist offenders to all men. So I'm very much one of these people who push back against this notion that it's toxic masculinity is the culprit. I think certain people are prone to violent behaviour, criminal behaviour, and a very small minority of people are repeat offenders and cause tremendous amounts of harm. Intimate partner violence, that's an issue, you know, where couples push each other and slam doors and yell at each other and that kind of thing, on the lower scale, those sorts of behaviours have are correlated with alcohol abuse. There's all sorts of social issues like poverty, stress, all sorts of issues that can impact on intimate partner violence. But I would again be cautious of blaming masculinity or all men for this problem.
One difficulty, I think, the reason why it's kind of put on all men, for example, is that people have difficulty really accepting the fact that there are some women who choose abusive partners over and over and over again, and they will choose these abusive partners even if they know that they've been previously convicted of or accused of domestic violence. So for some reason, women have a preference for some of these men. They don't just happen across them. And so this idea that women just get unlucky and they end up with a man who's a domestic abuser, rather than women are choosing men who have these specific characteristics, makes it seem like more men have these characteristics than do actually in reality.
I don't think one woman a week is choosing to be murdered, though.
I don't think anybody's choosing to be murdered, but if you look at the stats, for example, for how many people die in various other contexts, it's much, much bigger. There's this huge focus on how many women suffer at the hands of men, I think above and beyond many other more tractable, solvable problems. In a country of millions of people, how many women a week would you think, you know, what kinds of resources would you want to mobilize to prevent this one woman a week being murdered?
Well, I mean, if the statistic is 1 in 3 women say they've experienced violence, that does suggest it's rather more than simply anomalous people who are involved in it. And I mean, I kind of agree with Claire there. I mean, it seems to me that this is a product of all sorts of social factors, and there are obvious policy options that you could implement to do something about it. I mean, wouldn't you agree with that? If you...
Yeah, no, I would agree with it, and I'm one of the 1 in 3, and I think having social services, you know, places where women can go, where it's a safe haven, and social support, and helping women leave the home, you know, leaving a violent relationship when they need to. I mean, there's all sorts of things that...
and those shelters are vanishingly rare today.
Yeah, and so I think it's a fantastic idea to have more investment in services to help women escape from toxic relationships. I think perhaps we need to educate people in schools about red flags to look out for. Because some people are prone to violence, you know, these are things that you can, you know, exploitative behaviour, coercive behaviour, these are the red flags that you can look out for before you get tied up into a partnership that is going to be bad news later on down the track. I think there's all sorts of things we can do. But I do also agree with Diana. I mean, I think it's something like 3 women a day die from suicide. And we're not talking about that, are we? Yeah,
because it's a violence that women inflict upon themselves. One thing that I was going to say is that there's been some studies that show, you know, what is the most effective intervention. And I do think that this is another area where we come up against our evolved psychology, where when a man hurts a woman, we say he should be punished as harshly and as long as possible. And what often happens is men are put in prison for these crimes, and the women themselves don't actually want that. They don't actually want their partner to be put in prison. And there was a study done, I think in the United Kingdom, and I think there's been studies done in the United States, that actually, if you take these men who are serially abusive, you put them in a kind of cushy conference room, you give them coffee, you make them feel entitled, right? And then you actually appeal to their self-interest, and you say, actually, you know, why did you beat your wife or girlfriend? You let them talk about whatever reason that they think that rationalizes their behavior, and then you say, actually, it's not in your best self-interest to beat your wife or your girlfriend. And people find this kind of solution repugnant, because what they really want to do is punish the people who have done this the most, rather than actually doing the most effective solution, which is what women want in these contexts. They don't want their partners to go to prison on average. On average, they want to keep their partners, they just don't want to get beaten anymore.
Yes, well, perhaps unexpectedly, I entirely agree with that. I don't think prison is ever a solution. Look, we are really running out of time, and I did want to go to questions, but there's so much we haven't touched on. I want to at least touch on one other major issue, which is opposition to abortion has now become a central question for the American right. Less so in Australia, but I suspect we may see some more along these lines. I mean, the really extraordinary situation in Alabama at the moment, where the legislature has voted to outlaw all abortion procedures, even in the cases of rape or incest, with a doctor who performs an abortion being liable for 99 years in prison. How do we both respond to this? Should abortion be entirely legal? Should it be state funded? What kind of policy are you both advocating?
Yeah, the Alabama legislation is quite abhorrent, and it was really quite shocking to see that passed. However, I do agree with restrictions on late-term abortion. So I don't think abortion should be normalised or should be legalised in the final trimester or when a baby is viable, when a baby can survive outside of the womb on its own, because just for basic reasons that it's a human life and it can survive on its own. I think in the first few weeks, when there is no feeling of pain, no sentience, I just, I don't think the blastocyst or the embryo is going to suffer. And if a woman does not have the resources or capacity to bring a child into the world, then probably a very good idea to end it.
Being an American, what's your response?
I'm very much pro-choice, and I definitely think that women should have that option. I also agree with Claire that once the baby is sentient, that there should be restrictions on what you can do to a sentient being. But I agree with that across all species, not just in humans. And I also think that on the one hand, I'm very much pro-choice, but on the other hand, I think that what happens with the left is that they really undermine the idea of a sincerely held belief. And I do think that people on the right have a sincerely held belief that a human life should be preserved at all costs. And I think that this restriction, this loophole in that, in the case of rape or incest, a woman can have an abortion, is actually morally inconsistent with the idea that it is a human life and that you shouldn't kill a human life simply for whatever reason that it was brought into the world. I think one problem with the left is that they're unwilling to give women who are too poor or who don't want children any kind of incentives to get on birth control, because that smacks of eugenics. So what would be really good is if you were on some kind of social safety net for somebody to say, if you don't want to have children, we're actually going to give you an incentive to not reproduce. Whereas in the United States, women who are on, in almost all Western democracies, women who are very poor are actually given incentives to have more offspring, and they're certainly not given any kind of disincentives to get pregnant without planning.
Well, one incentive would be to stop them being poor, wouldn't it? I mean, I would seem to be.
We're going to come up against Marxism then.
Okay, now is your chance to ask some. We already have questions, do we? Can people see the number?
We can text it in.
043. Oh, you can see it. Okay. All right. How does this work? I have no idea. All right, we've got a whole bunch of questions. Some of them good, some of them not so good. All right, I'll read this first one. Does a hypocrisy exist in the social conservatives who promote traditional family values being better off financially and socially, and their dismissal or refusal to engage with the concepts of scientific communal child raising as raised by Diana, despite the potential overall social benefits? Would you like me to read it again?
Yeah, I think Claire's laughing like she understands. Claire, do you understand?
Sorry, I didn't understand the question.
Is there a hypocrisy in social conservatives promoting traditional family values being... Actually, I can't understand it, so we'll move on to the next one. Do you think that it's possible to educate males in schools about traditionally feminine domestic duties and females about male-dominated tasks?
Oh, yeah. Although I was in a home ec class and I ended up doing all of the embroidery for the guy next to me because he was really hopeless and he had big fat fingers. But I do think that men I think it's very surprising some of the things that children learn in school rather than learning how to cook and clean. I think that those are actually very fundamental things that people should learn.
And a personal view of mine is that instead of complaining about patriarchy, toxic masculinity and things like that, perhaps we as women could reward men who do nice things for us, like cleaning or cooking, with rewards, you know.
Like training your boyfriend thing. Yeah.
And date, you know, perhaps we should talk more about dating men who are, you know, who are not in high-powered careers. I mean, the way to fix some of these inequalities is by choosing men who don't conform to the traditional masculine stereotype.
Yeah.
And the onus should be more, not so much on men to release themselves from the shackle of the traditional masculine stereotype, but on women to reward those men who don't fit that norm.
Yeah, two things I think is, you know, over all cultures all over the world, men seek status. What actually, you know, that's a human universal. But what counts as status differs from place to place. If we accorded stay-at-home dads who were amazing at doing domestic duties, very high status, men would pursue that. And the other thing is that I totally agree with what Claire was saying. What I've often heard feminists say is, you know, why would you throw a man a parade for changing a nappy? He's just doing what women do. But that actually really doesn't get at the very fundamental sex differences, that men are just not as inclined to engage heavily in child rearing and cooking and cleaning as women are. And so they need a greater reward in order to incentivize that behavior than women do. And so either you want to be right or you want to be effective. You can choose one or the other.
Whew. Sorry, I'm just a bit overwhelmed by these questions. What are your thoughts on modern dating apps?
Tinder is like, are you a fox? Like, you just know that somebody's nearby and that you know what their face looks like. You know nothing about them. I just think that people, they think that we're really evolved, and yet we're using these dating apps, which basically just say, do you know that somebody's attractive and do you know that they're in close proximity? Like basically Tinder emulates what all mammals do all the time. I think that some modern dating apps can be really, really good. And I know that, you know, my mother met her new husband. She's very happy on Match. My brother met his wife on OkCupid. My father met his wife through Friends, and I think he could have done better. I'm just kidding. And so I think that it actually does help a lot. But I also do think that it gives people this plethora of choice that can be difficult for people to settle down. I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing because I'm not a traditionalist, but I do think that it's something that people should keep in mind.
Yeah, I agree with Diana. The only downside that I see is being overwhelmed with choice and therefore not being happy with what you've got, and potentially overlooking someone who might be a good fit simply because you're inundated with novelty and choice. Yeah, so it gives the illusion of choice potentially.
Yeah.
The housework issue has prompted many comments, but here's one. I find your ideas about housework very unsatisfactory. It's not just about women being fussy. There's a lot of work that has to be done to run a household. For example, buying, cooking food and washing school clothes. So what solutions have you got for sharing housework apart from paying someone poorer than you?
I mean, it just depends on who you marry and how you train them. I've not had a problem with this because I've basically chosen somebody who I thought would be willing and able to contribute 50-50 to what I would like. I mean, obviously, if you marry a man who's completely is not insensitive to your requests, then that sounds like a personal problem to me.
But those stats do suggest that it's fairly widespread.
Well, I mean, people. I do think that women have higher standards for these things than men do, and I also think that men tend to work more hours outside of the home. So it doesn't actually indicate a problem. It just indicates a sex difference. And if you think all sex differences are problematic, then I don't really know what to tell you.
It's not. It's not a problem that can be easily solved. It's a very difficult problem, and I think potentially a lot of people, in particular women, go into long-term relationships or marriage without considering how the division of labour is going to impact them, and potentially we need to talk about how it gets stressful and frustrating over time if division of labour is not shared. But I don't see how there can be any top-down solution coming from the government or society or even cultural norms. I don't see how there can be any kind of coercive solution to get people to do more housework if they're not already doing it. I just don't see how that can be possible in a free society.
But those cultural norms have shifted massively. I mean, in that stat I quoted, I think over the last 5 years, the amount of housework that men are doing has increased by about 4 hours.
Yeah.
So clearly social norms are having some consequences, aren't they?
Yeah, but there's also evidence that while increasingly both parents are working, both parents are spending more time with their kids, and in prior generations, parents invested a lot less time with their own children because children were out playing with other kids. So we've constructed these lifestyles where we impose great demands on ourselves, and I think one way of getting around that is just being more flexible with what we expect of each other. And I come back to rewarding men who do what we want them to do. If you meet a guy who's interested in doing 50% of the household labour or more, hang on to that guy, latch onto him.
All right, the questions are coming in thick and fast. We're probably going to run out of time, but here's another one. You've said women return to abusive relationships again and again. What would you then say of young women in first-time abusive relationships who didn't anticipate abuse?
Well, I think, so I've been in that situation, and one thing I did was go to the police, make a report, because you've got to break the cycle, you've got to break this notion that people can get away with it and keep doing it. And I think violence, it's a crime. You can report it to the police. A person can have a criminal record for assault. And I think we have, if we find ourselves in violent relationships, we have a somewhat of a duty to the rest of society to follow through and make a police report if someone has committed a crime against us. And hopefully that either scares the person involved to not do it again, or at least when it does happen again, the criminal justice system has some record that this person is a repeat offender.
I did have a whole bunch of questions to ask you about trans identity, which we've now run out of time, but we do have a question on it, which we've got 2 minutes to answer. Where does trans identity fit in such binary expressions of gender and its impact? I guess a lot of our discussion has been around cisgender heteronormative relationships. So if we...
Which are like 99% of, yeah. So basically when people complain about people not talking about trans people enough, I think that they often forget that trans people are some 1/3 of 1% of all people. And so obviously if you're trying to come up with societal solutions, it's more important to focus on the majority of people than it is to focus on small minorities of people. Trans people, they have certain kinds of characteristics that fit into one or the other kind of sexual psychology, and they obviously don't fit into a binary as such.
Yeah, I can't speak on behalf of transgender people or transsexual people, but obviously everything that we've talked about in terms of people having the ability to reach their potential and flourishing and have healthy relationships applies equally.
I think that's probably the end of the session, given it's 10:59:30. So thank you very much. Thank you all of you for coming along and your questions. Thank you to our 2 speakers, Claire Lehmann and Diana Fleischman. Thank you both. I have a feeling there's something else I was supposed to say, but I can't think. Books are on. Are you doing book signings or no? Okay. Well, we're done there.